The Joe Rogan Experience.
So, I've had the privilege of interacting with a lot of government organizations over the past few years as I've been digging down this rabbit hole. Law enforcement at a federal level, DOD, executive branch, legislative branch, and some of the folks that I've come in contact with, they specifically work on weapons of mass destruction. All right, so that's their job. So if there's a loose nuke in the United States, among other agencies, they would be some of the people that would be sitting in a skiff for 24 hours a day trying to figure out where it is and to go get it, right? So you can imagine that would be their number one priority, right? So I engage with these folks. I ask them, what's the sense here? People are kind of starting to panic a little bit, and this message is getting out there more and more broadly. And they assured me that's not the case, that there is not a loose nuke or other type of weapon of mass destruction that these objects, whatever they are pursuing right now. Otherwise, they would be working in a skiff nonstop to make that go away, that problem go away. So, that's part of why I have a high confidence level that this is not a response to a massive imminent, weapons of mass destruction threat on the eastern seaboard. So I just want to try to dispel that rumor right now. I've seen a lot of talk of that online. And I don't, although this is I think a dangerous and scary situation that's going on right now, at least from that particular angle, that's not the indications I'm receiving.
So how would they persuaded you? Just by saying that's not the case? Or have they given you any information that leads to this conclusion?
They would be the people actively working it, essentially, right? So,
and they're not?
They're not working it, right? So either the government is holding back that secret from the direct resources within the government that are responsible for finding these systems, or they're not working the issue because there isn't an issue there to work.
So the thing that I had heard was that it was a missing nuke from Ukraine. And if that was the case, what could they do? Is there any truth to this idea that we have the type of drone capability that we could send these things out and they would search for gamma radiation and they'd be able to find a nuke? Is that?
So there are teams that respond to those types of potential emergencies, typically within the Department of Energy. Having potentially hundreds of drones flying around trying to identify these isn't necessarily the best way. Gamma radiation is typically well shielded in weapons, and at very high altitudes or even moderate altitudes, like we're seeing these objects, it would be pretty difficult to detect them. And the way that NIST, the DOE, typically operates in this environment is ground-based teams searching for radiation itself. So it's not necessarily consistent with how they would do it to begin with. And then based off of that other information, that's what leads me to believe that's not the case.
Well, that makes me feel better because I was freaking out this weekend.
I think a lot of people were.
Yeah, I got a couple. But it's one of those things, especially in this day and age with social media. There's so many narratives that get spread and retweeted. And, I know a guy who's an insider and he says to get out of the East Coast and, head for Nevada or, there's a lot of that shit going on. Yeah. There's a lot of different versions of these drones, and this is what's weird. If they weren't ours, if they're not ours, you would think that they could just track them and find out, well, where are they landing, who's got them, how are they being used, is it RFI, like radio frequency, is it some sort of a different technology that's allowing them to pilot these things, like what is it?
Yeah.
They'd be able to tune into that and figure it out, right? So how come no one's been arrested? How come no one's been caught? How come they haven't, tracked these things down to the source?
Yeah, so there's a lot of good questions there. Let me back up by starting with the fact that this started about 2 years ago, at least. So,
but not like this.
A little bit like this.
Really?
So,
in this volume?
Not in this volume. That's the differentiator right there. But So Langley Air Force Base, you might be familiar with the fact that they had drone incursions of an unknown type, unknown origin last year.
Right.
That happened during about a 2.5, 3 week period right before Christmas. Right where we are now. Mm-hmm. That also happened the year before over Langley. Unknown objects operating over the base. They couldn't tell where they were going. They were unprepared for them. Same period of time, 2-3 weeks before Christmas. This is year 3, right? And they were expecting them to come again for third year in a row over Langley. And there was, some effort put forward to be able to better understand these when they came back. And they did come back, but they came back in a much wider swath, right? Now we have them all over New Jersey, all the way up to Massachusetts. And it's hard to tell exactly with the quality of the reporting right now, because it seems to be, the bigger the story gets, the more people are just looking up and seeing anything and pointing it out. But there are reports from Texas to Florida to California, Ohio, Minnesota, Pennsylvania. I mean, it's not just New Jersey itself, it seems. And even the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base was shut down for a drone incursion just this last Friday, a couple of days ago. So this isn't just a one-off event. It is in the sense that it's so large and so many people are paying attention to it. But this has been occurring for at least 3 years around military bases, and that's nothing to say with the incidents that we were seeing over the Eastern Seaboard and other training ranges that fighter pilots were seeing as they were doing their operations. So I'm a little hesitant to link it to the full story that we've been having here and this full conversation, but at least for 3 years this has been occurring. So, kind of getting back to your question, why can't we do more about it? It's a hard problem, I think, for a number of reasons. It's hard, but it's very solvable, right? I think this can be solved. We can solve it. But right now, kind of the word on the street is that these objects appear to be coming from over the ocean. There's senior congressmen, there's Coast Guard personnel, there's law enforcement. They're seeing a large number of these come from somewhere over the ocean. I don't know if that means necessarily they're popping out of the water physically or if they're coming from some unknown location in the water and then proceeding over the coast. I don't know how that relates to Ohio. That's a pretty long trip if they are coming over the ocean. And from the videos I've seen and the conversation I've had, they are detecting these objects through kind of normal mechanisms like radar systems, optical camera systems. They are flying very low. In some cases, they seem to be operating as a group in the vicinity of each other, flying past each other, flying very up close to each other, and then proceeding to do whatever they are that they're doing. It's an unknown right now if they are emitting energy or not. So, like radio communications or their own maybe active sensor systems. It's unknown. I've poked on that front, and the best I can tell, the government doesn't know either.
That seems so weird that they don't know that. Like, it's just very disturbing that someone could operate these things and have, how many, what is the estimated number of them?
That's a great question. At this point, I'm comfortable making a guess of probably over 800 or 1,000. And how many of those are sightings of the same object? How many of those are individual objects? How many of those are unique objects?
Right.
So it's tough to say, but this isn't just a few objects that people are seeing. And so I can imagine some technologies that will allow traditional UAVs or drones to operate without emitting, right? So they could have a self-contained navigational system, right? Maybe they have their own onboard maps and they're using cameras to map where they are.
So then they would be completely autonomous. You just send them out there and they would have a task and they would go through whatever their task is and navigate via their GPS or whatever tracking system they're using.
Exactly. And then, what is their task, right?
Right.
Is it just to instill panic and fear? Is it because they're sensing something? And if they are sensing something, they would have to be using what's called passive sensors, right? So like a camera system is passive, but if you're shooting a radar out and having it bounce off of something, that's active, right? And that's easier to detect than a passive system. So I could imagine, a fully self-contained autonomous drone system that is doing something potentially with passive sensors that allows it to operate without emissions, which is going to make it harder to track.
If they're doing it at night, if they do have passive systems, like some sort of an optical system, wouldn't that be hindered by the low light conditions, or do we have stuff that is able to detect whatever they're looking for at night?
Yeah, depends what they're looking for, but ultimately there is tech. There's electro-optical systems, there's infrared camera systems, not unlike the jets or the systems that we had on my jet. But we were able to detect these objects with infrared when we were flying off the Eastern Seaboard. There are a number of reports from law enforcement that their infrared systems are not able to pick these objects up. And not just this year, but also the incidents over Langley last year. The pilots that responded to that incident, I've spoken to them. they weren't able to lock these up with their infrared systems either. So they do seem to be exhibiting some type of signature management.
That's interesting. So is the signature management so is it a heat signature that they're giving off? So maybe there's some sort of a cooling mechanism inside of these things? Like how, if they have a propulsion system, so you would imagine it's some sort of an electric engine, right? Because a lot of them are very quiet. That's got to be giving off some kind of heat, right?
Yeah, and that goes to some like very base physics, right? Like
Yeah.
we create heat whenever we have, stored energy and we utilize it. So to be able to mitigate that to such a degree that you can't even detect them at all, it's pretty tough. I mean, I can imagine you can reduce your signature. We do it in fighter jets, right? Through kind of just like baffles where we cover the engine essentially to make it harder to see. But to have zero ability to detect or lock onto these objects is not a technology I'm familiar with.
So other than that, are they exhibiting any type of movement that's extraordinary, or their ability to turn angles? Is there anything about them that points to this being superior technology?
It's tough to say. Based on what I've seen just in the public from reports and kind of amateur photographers and witnesses, some of them do seem to be making pretty sharp turns. I wouldn't call them like physics breaking turns, but they don't seem to be operating like a normal aircraft, right? So they're down low. They're making what appear to be pretty high G turns, maybe like 3, 4, 5 G turns at relatively low airspeeds, which is indicative of them having a pretty significant power supply, right? Anytime you turn like that, you're burning energy essentially. So for them to be able to make these high G maneuvers and then remain in the area for another 5 or 6 or 7 hours and still have the battery life or whatever's propelling them to then go over the ocean to a point where they're untrackable. Again, I'm not really familiar with that type of capability either.
Yeah, it's the thing that disturbs me is not just that this is happening. There's so many drones and all these people are seeing them. It's happening for so long and nothing has been done. There's no, they're not scrambling jets to try to meet these things and follow them and track them. They're not shooting them down. They're not. It's just we appear so vulnerable because of this. Mm-hmm. Because if these are ours or if these are people just fucking around and it's not a threat, okay, great. But why is it so prevalent? Like, why are there so many of them, and why have there been nothing that these people that are trying to investigate this have been able to do that's effective to put a stop to this?
So there's some laws in this country that are a little bit antiquated when it comes to dealing with situations like this. So my understanding is right now these things are operating mostly in what's called Class G airspace, which is really low. It's away from airports. Not all, of course, right? They're over bases. So
they're over LaGuardia.
Yeah. But here's I think where a lot of the trouble is coming in from. I think the government has to make the presumption at this point, based off the feedback from the DoD and others, that if this is not a foreign adversary, then we have to make the assumption that it's a U.S. citizen that's operating these. Because of that, they essentially need a warrant in order to wiretap these.
What?
Yeah.
Even with the Patriot Act?
That's the feedback I'm receiving. That's the legal limitation.
Come on. They don't even need a warrant to get into my phone. Get the fuck out of here. I don't buy that.
Well, whether it's the reality situation or not, that's how they're proceeding, right? And so to overcome that, there's like a 120-page report that needs to be filed all the way up to the Deputy Attorney General of the United States in order to even intercept these signals that they may or may not even be emitting to be able to determine where they're going. And so I think that's one part of what's like slowing down this whole investigation. On the other hand, for base commanders, they have limited authorities to protect their base, but when they do, they need to submit basically a request all the way up to the Secretary of Defense. All right, so now you have this like super politically charged situation with a lot of risk of objects flying over the U.S. If they take action and shoot one of these down, even with the Secretary of Defense's permission, they're on the hook if that thing takes out a school bus or otherwise damages someone's property.
Or kills somebody.
Yeah.
Jamie, can you just do a quick search? Have there been drones that have been shot down?
I haven't seen anything. There's a story from 2 days ago. New Jersey lawmakers were having a press conference asking if the government could shoot one down so they can inspect it. So, I'm assuming they haven't shot one down if they're asking to shoot one down that day.